Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. I took the job 10 days before anyone used the word outbreak on television. At the time, it was just another contract in a long line of contracts I had taken since getting out of the private security world. My name is Joel Maddox. I was 38 years old, living in a rented casita on the west side of Phoenix, and doing what a lot of former contractors do when the better years are behind them. I worked short-term executive protection, the occasional site security assessment, and sometimes private patrol for people with more money than sense. The money was inconsistent. The clients were worse. But the work was work, and work paid rent. The call came from a staffing broker I knew in Scottsdale. He said a client needed a security lead for a temporary assignment west of Tonopah, out past the edge of where the suburbs gave up and the real desert started. The place was a private survival compound being built for a man named Grant Voss, founder of a supplements company called VitaForge. I knew the brand. His face had been on podcasts, business magazines, and those aggressive ads where a rich man in a fitted shirt stands in front of a helicopter and tells you the system is lying to you about health. He sold powders, capsules, meal replacement packs, emergency food kits, water filters, and a whole lifestyle built around the idea that society was soft and the smart people were getting ready for the hard times. I asked what the actual threat picture was. The broker laughed and said paranoia, civil unrest, election year nerves, that kind of thing. The pay was good enough that I stopped asking smart questions. The compound sat on private land about 20 miles south of Interstate 10, past a chain-link gate, down a graded dirt road that cut across flat desert and low scrub. The nearest real landmark was the Harquahala Plain, with the mountains far off and washed out in the heat. The whole place had been sold to Voss as a secure retreat. In reality, it looked like a high-end construction site that somebody had rushed because the client kept changing his mind. The perimeter wall was concrete block in some sections, steel mesh in others. Half the camera towers were installed, but not wired. One of the vehicle gates still had shipping plastic on the control box. There were 3 main buildings finished enough to occupy. The owner's residence, a long bunkhouse for staff and guests, and a utility building that held the generators, battery bank, water control, and communications room. Behind them were foundations for future structures that existed only as rebar, concrete pads, and stacks of materials baking in the sun. There was also an underground section, which Voss called the vault. It was not a military bunker. It was a reinforced basement with filtered air, heavy steel doors, food storage, medical lockers, and enough beds for maybe 20 people if they did not mind sleeping close. It was better than nothing, worse than the brochures he had probably been shown. The desert around the property worked both ways. It gave you sightlines, but it also gave you exposure. There was no tree cover worth mentioning, no river nearby, no shaded creek bed. If vehicles came at you, you would see them early. If you had to leave on foot in summer, you were in God's frying pan. I arrived with 1 duffel bag, 1 hard case, a pistol I carried legally, and a notebook. I always carried a notebook. People think security work is about weapons and hard looks. Real security is lists, habits, boring checks, and seeing problems before they become emergencies. The first problem was staffing. Voss had hired a mix of men who looked good in polo shirts, but had no idea how to run a secure site. His day shift supervisor, a broad guy named Kenny Reese, had worked nightclub security in Tempe and talked like every situation could be handled by standing wider and louder. The overnight man, Luis Ortega, had done years with a county detention transport contractor and was the only one besides me who understood chain of command. There were 4 other guards rotating between gate duty, mobile patrol, and camera watch. 2 of them were young enough that they still confused confidence with competence. One was a retired Phoenix police sergeant named Dale Harmon, who had a bad knee, a good mind, and the habit of saying the exact right thing in the least pleasant tone possible. The non-security staff were another problem. There were 12 construction workers still finishing systems, mostly electricians, plumbers, and concrete guys. There was a married couple who handled food service. There was a maintenance technician named Naveen Patel, who had apparently been hired because he could keep generators, pumps, HVAC units, solar inverters, and anything else with wires or fuel alive longer than they wanted to stay alive. There was a physician assistant named Marisol Vega, who had been brought in to stock the medical room and give Voss the appearance of taking health seriously. There was Voss's personal assistant, Talia Shu, who did more actual management than anyone else on site. And there were clients. The clients were the reason I knew, inside 6 hours, that the job was going to become ugly. Voss was letting a selected group of subscribers and business associates visit the compound before final completion, as if it were a luxury retreat crossed with a preparedness seminar. Men in expensive boots, women in designer sunglasses, couples who posted filtered videos about disconnecting from modern dependence while asking the kitchen if the almond milk had been chilled. They had paid for premium access, or donated to some foundation, or invested in one of Voss's side ventures. However they had gotten there, they all carried the same belief. That money had purchased them a seat on the lifeboat. Voss himself met me on the first afternoon. He was taller than I expected, lean, tan, white teeth, silver at the temples in a controlled way that costs real money. He wore tactical-looking clothes that had never touched honest dirt before the compound. He walked the site with me like a man showing off a private kingdom. He talked about destabilization, urban fragility, supply chain collapse, civil unrest, cyber disruption, food riots, rolling blackouts. He did not sound crazy exactly. Plenty of what he said was possible. The problem was that he treated risk the way rich men treat weather, as something that becomes manageable once you pay enough people to stand around it. "We are not building a bunker," he told me, as if he'd practiced the line. "We are building a continuity enclave." I looked at a half-installed motion sensor hanging loose from a tower support and said, "Right now you're building a place with gaps." He smiled like he enjoyed blunt men as long as they worked for him. "Then close them." I spent the first 2 days doing exactly that. I mapped the perimeter. I identified dead zones in the camera coverage. I reassigned the weak guards away from critical posts. I set fixed check times for the generators and battery systems. I reduced gate access and started logging every vehicle in and out properly, not just waving people through because somebody recognized somebody. I had Luis test radio coverage across the property. We found 2 spots near the south fence where handheld traffic came in broken. Naveen said he could rig an extender but needed parts from Phoenix. I told Talia to get them moving now, not next week. The armory was another joke. Voss loved the appearance of readiness, so he had spent money on hardware without spending thought on management. The rifles were good quality but poorly tracked. The pistols were in lock boxes with wrong serials on 2 inventory sheets. Half the plate carriers had no medical pouches. Somebody had bought night vision binoculars, but no extra batteries worth the name. There were pallets of freeze-dried food and stacks of bottled water, but the ammunition was stored in a room that ran hotter than it should have. Nothing was catastrophic. Everything was sloppy. Look, I wrote it all down and handed the report to Talia, because I already knew Voss would skim it and talk over me. She read every page, looked up, and said, "This is the first honest assessment anybody's given him." That usually doesn't make me popular. "It might this time," she said. It did not. Voss accepted the report, then spent dinner explaining to a table full of paying guests that his compound had been built according to advanced security principles drawn from executive protection doctrine, municipal resilience planning, and off-grid best practices. He nodded at me twice while doing it, as if I were a consultant there to validate the story. Afterward, he pulled me aside and said I needed to balance rigor with confidence. In his words, people had to feel safe. I said, people feel safe when systems work. He said, people invest when the atmosphere is right. That was when I understood the core problem. The compound was not a serious refuge yet. It was a product launch wearing desert camouflage. On day 3, the news started getting strange. At first, it was a handful of stories buried under the usual noise. A violent incident in Nogales involving a border holding facility and emergency responders. A highway pileup outside Las Cruces tied to a driver who had apparently become disoriented, then aggressive. A county health department in Southern California investigating a cluster of unexplained febrile cases. Then clips online from Phoenix of a man in a gas station attacking customers with what looked like mindless fury before being tackled. Another one from Tucson where paramedics were backing away from a woman on a sidewalk because she kept getting back up after they thought she had stopped moving. Individually, none of it meant the end of the world. Together, it made the hair rise on the back of my neck. The guards talked about it at shift change. The kitchen staff watched it on phones while chopping vegetables. Construction crews stood around at lunch replaying shaky videos and arguing whether they were real. Voss dismissed it all as a social breakdown amplified by media panic. He gave an impromptu talk in the main hall about why prepared communities would outlast urban failure. People applauded. Marisol Vega did not applaud. She found me after dinner and asked whether the site had a proper quarantine plan. I told her no, because no one had briefed me on one. She said, "Then we need one before anyone shows up sick." That sentence stayed with me. We spent an hour walking through the medical room, the lower-level sleeping area, and a storage annex that could be cleared fast if needed. Marisol was practical, calm, and had the kind of directness you only see in people who have already spent years dealing with chaos in smaller forms. She had worked urgent care in Yuma, done rotations in overloaded emergency settings, and understood the distance between what people imagine medicine can do and what it actually can do when systems bend. She told me the site had decent trauma supplies, basic antibiotics, IV fluids, oxygen, monitors, and a small refrigerator for medications, but almost nothing for serious infectious control beyond masks, gloves, and a lot of wishful thinking. "Your boss thinks in branding," she said. "Viruses don't care about branding. Neither do desperate people. That too." We marked one room in the lower level as temporary isolation and another as overflow. I had Luis put a coded lock on the stairwell access. It was a bad solution, but bad solutions are still solutions when time is short. By day 4, Voss's phone was ringing constantly. More guests arrived, some invited, some not fully on the list but somehow waved in anyway after speaking to him directly. A venture capitalist from Dallas, a fitness influencer couple from Orange County, an older ranch owner from New Mexico with 2 grandsons and 3 gun cases, a former television doctor with 1 million followers, and a face that could still sell certainty to people. They came in SUVs loaded with premium luggage, coolers, food bins, and enough personal demands to fill a hotel complaint book. I wanted the gate locked down tighter. Voss wanted flexibility. I wanted weapons accounted for and issued by protocol. Voss wanted his guests reassured that they had access to what they had paid to access. I wanted all non-essential staff dismissed while roads remained open. Voss wanted construction finished faster. On day 5, one of the electricians left after hearing that his sister in Mesa was sick. 2 laborers left with him. One cook wanted to go but stayed because her husband said the highways were already becoming unpredictable near Buckeye. Local deputies stopped answering routine calls in 2 nearby counties except for priority incidents. State transportation alerts mentioned crashes, closures, and abnormal congestion along the westbound corridors. The cell network still worked, but it had that lag people notice before they admit they are worried. That afternoon, I took a truck to the North Ridge above the property with Dale Harmon. From up there you could see dust lines from vehicles on far dirt roads and the faint shimmer of traffic on the interstate. Dale had a pair of compact binoculars and the permanent expression of a man who trusted nobody's judgment but his own, including his own from yesterday. "You ever see people get stupid in slow motion?" he asked. "All the time." He nodded toward the compound. "That place is a magnet for it." Dale had been around enough disasters to know the pattern. First, denial, then confidence theater, then selective panic, where the people with means decide the rules no longer apply to them because they paid early. He said if the thing on the news was real and moving north, we needed 3 policies before sunset. Who gets admitted, who gets disarmed, who gets refused even if they know the owner. I said I agreed. Voss did not. He spent that evening holding court in the dining area, telling people the compound was built for exactly this sort of instability. He had a whiskey in one hand and a laser pointer in the other, clicking through a presentation about resilience. No one laughed when the power flickered halfway through slide 6. That was the first generator fault. Naveen got the backup line stable in under 10 minutes, but he told me privately the primary generator on Utility A was showing irregular load behavior and overheating under transfer. He thought it was either a cooling issue or a bad sensor chain. Either way, he needed a longer maintenance window to shut it down, strip panels, and test. "Take the window," I said. He looked toward the owner's residence. Music was still playing inside. "Your billionaire won't like losing air conditioning. Then he can be unhappy in a lit building instead of comfortable in a dead one." Naveen grinned for the first time since I had met him. That night, the first people hit the gate asking for shelter. A family of 4 in a dusty pickup came in from the North Road just after midnight. Husband, wife, teenage son, younger daughter. The father had a cut over one eye and kept saying there had been an incident at a truck stop. He used words like attack and sickness, and people losing their minds. The wife was pale and barely holding it together. The girl had a blanket around her shoulders. They said someone in Buckeye had told them there was a secure compound out here taking people in. That was the moment rumor became operational reality. We kept them outside the inner gate while Marisol checked them visually under floodlights. No obvious bites, no fever that we could confirm from a no-contact scanner at distance, no severe confusion. Their truck bed was full of household bins, a dog crate, and a generator. They looked like normal people who had left in a hurry and run out of good options. I called Talia. She called Voss. Voss told me to admit them temporarily and sort details in the morning. Dale muttered, "There it is. Rule number 1, there are no rules." I admitted them to a holding area near the maintenance shed, away from main housing. The little girl was asleep on her mother's shoulder by the time we got them cots, and the father thanked me like I had saved his life. Maybe I had. Maybe I had just opened the door to losing everyone else. That is the problem with Gates. Every decision feels moral in one direction and suicidal in the other. By sunrise, there were 6 more vehicles outside. Some had heard through social media, some through friends. One man said he had been a donor to Voss's foundation and named a dinner venue in Scottsdale as if that was a passport. One woman from Goodyear had her elderly mother in the passenger seat and kept saying they had nowhere else to go. A pair of brothers in a landscaping truck demanded to see the owner. We turned them all away, except the woman and her mother, because the mother was on oxygen and Marisol judged that moving them again might kill her quicker than anything else. Every person admitted added a problem. Every person refused created a different one. By midday on day 6, Phoenix was in visible distress. The feeds showed crowded emergency departments, police staging points, fires in scattered districts, and traffic jams on the loops. State officials were calling it a severe public safety emergency involving violent behavior associated with an unknown medical event. Broad language, careful language. The kind officials use when they are trying not to say what everyone can see. A helicopter passed far overhead around noon, heading west. Not news, not medevac. Too high to identify. Everyone on site stopped what they were doing to watch it. I think we all wanted some sign that professionals, real professionals with bigger plans and better tools, were still moving pieces on the board. But a helicopter flying one direction tells you nothing. Voss still wanted optimism. He wanted the dining schedule maintained. He wanted the guests reassured. He wanted the media room set up in case he decided to record a leadership message for his subscribers. When I told him the gate policy had to tighten immediately, and all admissions had to stop pending medical screen and resource review, he accused me of overreacting. "You are paid to secure this compound," he said. "I am trying to. Not by creating panic. Panic is already here. It just hasn't reached your dining room yet." He leaned closer and dropped his voice. "My people need to see continuity, Joel, not martial law." I said, "Then find somebody else to run security theater." He stared at me a long second, measuring whether I was replaceable. Then he smiled that thin rich man smile again and said, "Do your job. Just remember whose compound this is." I walked out before I said something that would end the contract. That afternoon, Luis called from Tower 2. There were multiple figures moving on foot about a mile east, near the road junction where the graded track met the county access route. Through optics, they looked unsteady, scattered, not coordinated. Could have been stranded motorists. Could have been hikers. Could have been worse. I took the truck with Dale, and one younger guard named Preston drove to the outer observation berm and watched through binoculars. They were people, all right. 7 of them, maybe 8. Hard to tell because one kept dropping behind the others and then appearing again. Their clothes looked like road clothes, not hiking gear. One man stumbled, and another walked straight into him without reacting the way normal people do. A woman was moving with one arm hanging wrong. No one carried visible water. No one shaded their face. They were less than a mile from open desert heat and acting like heat no longer mattered. Preston said, "What do we do if they come here?" I said, "We do not open the gate." He swallowed. "What if they're just hurt?" Dale answered before I could. "Then they're hurt outside." It sounded cold, but he was right. Out there in the desert, miles from stable medical support, with a compromised site and limited staff, Mercy could become mass casualty in one bad minute. We tracked the group until dusk. 2 wandered south. 3 kept angling west. 1 dropped and did not get up. Another crouched beside the one on the ground for a while, and then stood and kept going alone. Human movement stripped of human meaning. That was when the videos from the news finally became real to me. Not because I saw monsters, because I saw people emptied out and still moving. That night, the compound held a meeting in the main hall. I insisted on it. Guests, staff, workers, security, everyone. Voss tried to turn it into a leadership address. I turned it into an operations briefing. I told them the truth as cleanly as I could. Regional services were becoming unreliable. Roads west and east of Phoenix were unstable. There was credible evidence of violent behavior linked to an unknown condition. The compound had power, water, food, fuel, and medical supplies, but only if we treated them as shared resources, not luxury inventory. Effective immediately, there would be ration controls, strict movement protocols, lights, discipline after dark, and no one would approach the perimeter without authorization. Weapons would be issued only to trained personnel or to civilians assigned to a supervised defense roster. Anyone feeling sick had to report immediately to Marisol. No exceptions. Some people accepted it. Some looked angry. A woman in expensive desert boots asked if I understood who several of them were. I told her no, and it did not matter. A man near the back said he had paid for exclusive access. Dale laughed out loud at that, a short, dry sound that shut the room up better than my answer would have. Then Grant Voss stepped forward and said, "Joel is implementing temporary measures while we assess the broader situation." Temporary. He could not help himself. I went to bed after midnight in a security room with a cot, boots on, radio at my side, pistol under the folding chair, and the clear sense that the compound was now two problems at once. The outside problem was the outbreak. The inside problem was hierarchy. In bad situations, people do not stop wanting status. They want it more. Day 7 started with screaming. One of the admitted refugees from the first night, the father from the pickup, went into distress just after dawn. Fever, confusion, rapid aggression. He had apparently hidden a bite high on his side under the arm, probably from the truck stop incident he had mentioned. His wife found him in the holding room, trying to force open the door after he had already shoved their son hard enough into a wall to leave him dazed. Marisol called it fast over the radio. I arrived with Louis and Dale. We secured the wife and kids outside, or the man kept slamming himself into the door frame, not speaking clearly, making sounds that did not fit anything rational. Marisol said, "He cannot stay in there with them." We moved him into isolation with gloves, masks, eye protection, and a restraint strap system meant for medical transport. Even then, it barely worked. He had that terrifying mismatch between injury and effort, like the normal brakes had come off. I am not going to dress it up. It was one of the hardest things I have ever watched, because the wife was on the other side of the window saying his name, and he was already too far gone to hear it. He was dead by mid-morning. He was also not still. That sentence is the dividing line in my life. Before it, you can argue about pathogens, neurology, mass hysteria, toxins, any label that makes a disaster feel understandable. After it, labels do not matter. We all saw what we saw. Marisol confirmed no pulse, no respirations, fixed eyes. Then movement again minutes later, wrong and empty and violent. The room went silent except for the air handler. Dale said, very quietly, "Well, that settles that." Marisol backed away and looked at me, because everyone was waiting for someone to decide what came next. The wife was outside, the children were outside. Staff were starting to gather. News from phones was worse by the hour. And inside the isolation room was a thing that had been a man 4 hours earlier. I made the call. Luis and I contained it. We used tools, distance, barriers, and as little exposure as possible. I am not going into detail beyond that. What mattered was the result. The threat ended. The room had to be sealed, and later sanitized with what limited protocols we could manage. The wife collapsed when I told her her husband was gone. The teenage son stood there with his fists clenched, and the empty, shocked face boys get when they are trying not to become little kids again in front of strangers. Word spread before I could control it. By lunch, the compound was split into camps. People who wanted anyone with symptoms expelled immediately. People who wanted every gate shut forever. People who wanted to leave while they still could. People who suddenly treated Marisol like she should have miracles in the medical room. People who acted like the dead man's wife had done something wrong by not knowing about the bite. Voss disappeared for most of the afternoon, which told me all I needed to know about him. When he reappeared, he wanted to record a message. He had decided the world needed to hear from him. I said absolutely not. Broadcasting our location when displaced people were already finding us was insane. He said his audience needed leadership. I said leadership started with keeping the gate from being overrun. He told Talia to override me. Talia looked at him and said, "No." It was the first time I saw him truly surprised. Naveen cornered me near the utility building just before dusk. The primary generator problem was worse than expected. Cooling fan assembly damage, likely from a rushed installation or shipment impact. It could run, but not hard and not continuously. The backup generator was healthy, but fuel balance, load transfer, and overall redundancy were now much thinner. The solar array helped during daylight, but battery storage alone would not carry the compound cleanly if both generators went down or if a transfer fault happened under peak demand. "How bad?" I asked. "If everyone lives like rich people, very bad," he said. "If everyone lives like they are trying not to die, manageable." So, we cut the comforts. Air conditioning reduced. Non-essential lighting killed. Kitchen refrigeration prioritized over vanity loads. Owner's residence treated like every other building whether the owner liked it or not. That brought Voss stomping into the utility room in loafers and fury. He demanded his private suite climate restored immediately. Naveen did not even look at him. He just pointed to the live load monitor and said, "That number is why you are sweating." I almost liked the day for that moment alone. Late that night, a convoy came in from the highway. 3 vehicles, 2 lifted pickups and a black SUV with dark glass. 8 men total, all armed openly, all claiming to be part of a contracted recovery team sent by one of Voss's investor groups. They had the owner's name, his business contacts, and a printout of a property map that should never have been outside controlled channels. Their leader was a shaved-headed man in his 40s named Mercer Boone. He smiled too much and kept one hand near his rifle, as if he wanted us to notice how casual he was being about it. I made them halt outside the outer gate. No one was coming in armed at night without verification. Boone said, "Friend, you do not have the luxury of being difficult. We have personnel, fuel, and medical stock." Maybe they did. Maybe they also had plans to take over the site by morning. I asked for names, affiliations, callback contacts, and a reason they had a map of the property. Boone answered with patient mockery and a story about mutual benefit. Behind me, on the wall, floodlights threw hard shadows across the gate. Behind Boone, the desert swallowed everything beyond the vehicles into black. Dale murmured over the radio from Overwatch, "Say the word, and I turn their tires into a maintenance issue." I told him to hold. Talia woke Voss to verify the investor story. Voss came to the gate wearing a robe under a field jacket, hair disordered for the first time, eyes bloodshot, and immediately started acting like Boone's arrival was a gift. He recognized one of the names Boone dropped. That was enough for him. He wanted them admitted. I blocked him physically. He said, "Stand down, Joel." I said, Not until I search them, disarm heavy weapons, and separate vehicles. Boone smiled wider. You see? A professional. That's rare. Rare or not, it saved us. Because when we searched the vehicles, we found the fuel Boone had promised, plus medical stock, plus extra weapons, plus restraints, plus enough food for maybe a week. We also found handwritten notes listing high-value individuals likely to be on site. Voss, 2 investor names, 1 influencer with millions of followers. No mention of staff, no mention of general guests. Boone said it was just contingency planning. I believed him in the same way I believe rattlesnakes are ropes until they move. I admitted 4 of them, quartered separately, and kept the other 4 and their vehicles outside the inner perimeter under guard until daylight. Boone did not like that, which made me more confident it was right. At dawn, one of his outside men tried to slip the vehicle cordon and access the North Service Road. Luis caught it on camera, intercepted him, and put him flat on the gravel before the man could clear the truck. Boone came down furious, not at his own man, but at us for embarrassing him. That was when the compound had its first internal armed standoff. Nothing happened in the cinematic sense. No dramatic speeches, no thunder. Just 10 armed people in desert morning light, all one mistake away from turning a private compound into a kill box. Boone stared at me. I stared back. Voss shouted that this was unacceptable. Dale had sightlines. Luis had his rifle steady and low. Marisol was in the background pulling civilians away from doors where they had begun watching like it was a show. Boone finally lifted both hands and said, "We are all on the same side." "No," I said. "We are all on the same property. That is different." By noon, I had them disarmed or gone. Boone took the gone option. He left with 2 trucks, 1 spare fuel trailer, and all the resentment in the world. I kept some supplies under a theory of emergency levy that would not hold up in court and no longer mattered anyway. As he drove out, Boone told me I'd made an enemy of the wrong kind of men. Maybe. But he had left, and we were still whole. That evening, the first mass movement passed near the property. Not a horde. I am careful with words. Not a movie wave. It was a drifting line of maybe 40 or 50 infected and displaced people moving west to east across the scrubland about a mile out, likely drawn by sound, motion, headlights from the highway. Or no reason at all we could understand. Some were clearly sick in the way we had come to fear. Others may have been exhausted civilians in no better shape. The distance and twilight made certainty hard. What mattered was that they existed in numbers, and numbers change every plan. We went dark as much as the compound allowed. Floodlights off. Exterior movement minimized, vehicles killed. Radio discipline tight, everyone inside and low. We watched from the towers as the line drifted across the plain under the last orange edge of the sky. A few peeled toward our direction, then wandered off again. One reached the South Wash and stayed there circling for an hour like its brain had snagged on the terrain. Sometime after midnight, the last visible movement faded east. No one slept much. Day 8 was the day Grant Voss died. Not dramatically. Not fighting. Not nobly. He died in his own half-finished compound because he would not accept that the world no longer cared who he had been. He had kept a private satellite communication suite in his residence, something he had not fully disclosed because he liked holding information as leverage. Talia found out only because he ordered one of the younger guards to bring power back to a private room that had been cut from the load schedule. When I confronted him, he admitted he had been in contact with people in Scottsdale and one state-level political donor somewhere farther east. He believed a secure extraction might still be arranged for him, and select individuals if he could maintain comms. Select individuals, I repeated. He said, "Key personnel." I asked if kitchen staff were key personnel, if construction workers were, if the mother on oxygen at the holding annex was, if the teenager whose father had died in isolation was. He did not answer because he did not need to. I could see the math on his face. We argued in the hall outside his suite. Talia was there. Dale came in halfway through. So did Marisol. Voss said the compound could not support everyone long-term, and rational prioritization was necessary. I said that was a pretty phrase for abandonment. He said I was thinking like hired muscle, not leadership. I said he was thinking like a man still buying outcomes after the store had burned down. He slapped me. It did not hurt much. What mattered was the room going silent after. I took one step back because I did not trust my own anger. Dale moved between us, not to protect Voss, but to make sure I did not ruin the entire chain of control in 1 second. Voss straightened his jacket and said, "You are relieved." Talia said, "No, he isn't." Then Voss clutched the edge of the hall table, went pale, and dropped. Heart attack, stroke, stress event, who knows? Marisol started working immediately. She did everything possible with the gear we had. But he was gone before she was 10 minutes in. There were people in the doorway praying, crying, whispering. The man who had built the compound as an insurance policy died before he ever learned how to live inside the claim. I wish I could say his death brought clarity. It did not. It brought a power vacuum. By dusk, people were already maneuvering. One faction, led by the former television doctor and the venture capitalist from Dallas, wanted a civilian council. They used words like governance and orderly transition, which really meant they wanted soft control of resources through social authority. Another faction, mostly practical staff and the few guests who had adapted to reality, wanted the site run by whoever could actually keep the lights on and the gates secure. Talia wanted a command structure that combined operations, medical, and logistics. Dale wanted anyone who argued too much thrown out the gate with a road flare and a map. Luis just wanted clear orders and no stupidity near the perimeter. I did not want command. I wanted the compound to stay alive another day. But sometimes that is command whether you ask for it or not. So we formed the ugliest workable structure I could imagine. I handled security and final emergency decisions. Talia handled rationing, assignments, and records. Marisol controlled medical screening, quarantine, and health status reporting. Naveen controlled power, water, fuel, and maintenance authority. Dale oversaw training and discipline for any armed volunteers. Luis ran watch rotations and communications. It was not democracy, it was survival administration. The first thing I did under that structure was the thing everyone hated. I froze admissions completely. No one without full distance screening, search, isolation capacity, and resource review. In practical terms, that meant almost no one. We posted signs outside the outer gate with directions to a county relief waypoint we had heard mentioned on emergency radio traffic, though I had no confidence it still functioned. We left limited water cases in a shaded drop area outside the perimeter once a day when feasible, retrieved only after visual confirmation of no immediate threat. It felt cruel. It was also the only way to avoid turning the compound into a public terminal. The second thing I did was worse. I planned for abandonment. The compound looked strong from the outside, but once you stripped away ego and expense, it had weaknesses that bothered me more each hour. Too visible, too dependent on generator reliability, too many civilians with conflicting expectations, too much open ground and too few trained defenders. If a large, determined human group came for it, the walls might hold a while, but the systems behind the walls were fragile. A true refuge is not just defensible, It is sustainable and hard to notice. We were only one of those things, maybe. Talia understood immediately. "You think this place is bait," she said. "I think it becomes bait the longer the world gets worse." For who? For everyone. We began quiet contingency work, mapping vehicles that still ran reliably, separating high-value medical stock into mobile loads, identifying who could drive, shoot, fix, lift, or navigate, reviewing alternate sites. There were old service roads leading toward lesser-known utility corridors, and a mining track farther south that connected to a dry wash system. None were good escape routes. Good escape routes do not exist when society is falling apart. There are only less bad ones. Day 9 broke with smoke on the horizon to the northeast. Not close, but visible. Thin at first, then spreading into a dirty smear under the morning sky. Could have been a wreck. Could have been brush. Could have been a neighborhood burn. In another life, you would call dispatch, note the wind, and move on. In that life, all it meant was one more place no longer functioning normally. We picked up more emergency traffic on handheld scan, fragmented law enforcement calls, medical requests with no units available, highway incidents, unconfirmed attack clusters, advice to avoid contact with symptomatic individuals, advice to shelter in place, advice that stopped sounding like advice and started sounding like people repeating words because they had no power left behind them. That afternoon, the mother on oxygen died quietly in her sleep. Natural causes, or as natural as anything, gets in a disaster. Her daughter sat beside her for an hour after Marisol confirmed it, just holding the woman's hand. There was no funeral plan for that kind of place, no prepared language. We wrapped her carefully and moved her to a cooled storage area away from the living. The daughter thanked us in a calm voice that made it worse. You do not think about death logistics when rich men advertise survival. You think about them very quickly once reality starts billing the property. That evening, Kenny Reese, the nightclub security supervisor, got drunk. I had already reduced alcohol access because alcohol plus fear plus firearms is a formula even amateurs should understand. Kenny found a private stash in one of the guest suites, drank enough to become brave in the wrong way, and started telling people the compound was doomed if it stayed under my command. He said I was turning it into a prison. He said we should open the gates, consolidate numbers, arm everyone, and take what we needed from surrounding properties while the weak were still confused. I pulled him aside with Dale in the corridor outside the dining hall. Kenny puffed up and put a finger in my chest. He was trying to create an audience, trying to turn discipline into a public contest. I told him once to step back. He swung. Dale caught the arm. I put Kenny on the floor, and Luis helped drag him to a locked room to sleep off the bottle and reconsider his career path. The real damage was not the swing. It was that 6 people watching had clearly been half convinced by his argument. In every collapse, there are those who start seeing predation as leadership. They are often louder than the useful people. We should have expelled him the next morning. We did not. That was my mistake. I kept telling myself manpower mattered. In truth, our judgment mattered more. On day 10, the day the outbreak was finally named as a national emergency by whatever remained of formal authority, the compound nearly died from within. It began before sunrise with a camera gap. Tower 2 feed blinked out for 23 seconds. That might not sound like much, but 23 seconds is enough time to cut a panel, jam a lock, or get someone through a service route if you know where to go. Luis flagged it instantly. We reviewed nearby feeds. Nothing obvious. I sent Preston and Dale to inspect the tower line while I checked the control room. Naveen found the cause first. Manual interruption at an exterior junction box. deliberate. While we were still tracing that, the North Service Gate alarm tripped. Kenny Reese had gotten out. Later, we learned one of the younger guards had unlocked his room during morning turnover because Kenny said he needed the restroom and promised to cooperate. Kenny had then slipped through the utility side, cut power at the junction, and opened the North Service Gate for Boone's people, or somebody very much like Boone's people. 2 trucks came hard through the track while the watch picture was degraded. They were not infected. They were worse in the strategic sense. Hungry men with a plan. The first truck took rounds into the engine block before it cleared the bend because Dale had eyes and no patience left. The second swerved, clipped a bollard, and dumped 2 men into the gravel. One fired wildly at the tower. Another tried to run the vehicle toward the utility building, which told me immediately their target was power or fuel, not just shelter. I moved with Luis along the interior wall toward the service lane. Radios were loud, civilians screaming indoors, somebody in the main hall knocking over chairs. The desert after dawn was already bright enough to flatten everything into harsh contrast. The truck windows flashed. Dust kicked up. One of Boone's men, or maybe some other group wearing the same kind of ambition, used the disabled first truck as partial cover and started shouting that they only wanted water, fuel, and safe passage. That might even have been true for some of them. It did not matter. They had breached under deception. We drove them out fast and hard. I am not giving a play-by-play. What mattered was the sequence. Disable mobility. Deny access to the utility building. Keep civilians away from lines of fire. Maintain cross-cover. You do not let panic break formation. In that kind of event, training is not about winning. It is about reducing how many stupid deaths happen in the next 60 seconds. By the end of it, 1 truck was burning lightly from the engine compartment. 2 intruders had fled into the scrub. 1 was down and alive but injured. Kenny was nowhere visible. And one of our younger guards had a shoulder wound that Marisol treated in the medical room while swearing calmly enough to impress me. Dale had a crease across one forearm where something had passed too close. Luis looked like a man who had aged 5 years in 5 minutes. We found Kenny near the north retaining wall trying to reach one of the fleeing men. He was carrying a carbine, 2 spare magazines, and the expression of a man who still believed he could talk himself back into legitimacy. He claimed he had opened the gate to trade supplies and manpower, that the compound needed a stronger force structure, that I was too rigid to see opportunity. I remember looking at him and feeling very little. Not rage, not surprise, just a hard, tired certainty. He was disarmed, restrained, and confined under watch. There was no court left to hand him to, no jail worth transporting to, only choices. Later that night, after consultation with Talia, Dale, Marisol, and Luis, we expelled him at daylight with water, a marked direction of travel, and no weapon. Some will say that was mercy, some will say it was cowardice. I say it was the least poisonous answer available. The raid changed everything. If armed opportunists had us mapped and were probing the gates this early, we were on borrowed time. Boone might return. Someone else certainly would. Gunfire had advertised our existence farther than any online message could have. And the generator strain was still there. Naveen told me bluntly that if the utility building took a real hit, we would lose refrigeration, pumping support, comms reliability, and part of our lighting posture almost at once. That afternoon, with smoke still faint on the horizon and heat rolling over the concrete pads, I gathered the people who mattered and said what I had been avoiding for 2 days. We leave. No one argued right away because the word had already been waiting in the room. We could not move everyone far, not in one trip, not with the vehicles we had, not with the roads as they were. But we could move enough people and enough critical stock to reduce our profile and shift from visible fortress to dispersed survival group. I had identified a maintenance service complex tied to an old water infrastructure route farther southwest, not marked clearly on public maps, partly bermed, partly hidden by terrain, with underground pump access and fewer obvious approach lines. It was no paradise. It was just better than sitting in a lit compound that every rumor-driven scavenger in central Arizona would hear about sooner or later. The hardest part was telling the others. Some resisted instantly. The venture capitalist said abandoning a fortified site would signal weakness. The television doctor said relocating medically fragile people was unacceptable. A lifestyle couple asked whether there would be private sleeping arrangements at the new place, which told me they were still living in the wrong universe. But most people had heard enough gunfire and watched enough faces change over the previous days to understand that walls alone were not safety. We spent the rest of day 10 preparing quietly and fast. Fuel siphoned and balanced, water containers loaded, medical cold chain prioritized, ammunition reissued and tracked properly for once in that site's short life. Food broken into mobile lots instead of warehouse pride stacks. Vehicle order assigned by need, not status. Marisol chose who required monitored transport. Talia made the departure manifest with the kind of cold precision accountants probably use in war zones once numbers stop being abstract. Naveen rigged remote overloads on 2 non-critical systems so the compound would look alive longer after we left. Dale trained 6 civilians in convoy basics and seat assignments because panic in a moving vehicle kills just as efficiently as panic at a gate. We departed before dawn on day 11, though by then date and day had started losing their old meaning. The convoy was smaller than the compound deserved and larger than the road liked. 2 service trucks, 1 fuel trailer, 3 SUVs, 1 maintenance flatbed, 1 utility side-by-side on the trailer deck for later use. We left signs. We left sealed notes with directions to water caches. We left more than I liked. We also left bodies wrapped and marked because there was no holy way left to do any of it. As we rolled out through the south access, I looked back once. The compound stood in gray pre-dawn like a lie with expensive walls. Half-finished, overbuilt, underprepared, too visible to survive the shape the world had taken. Grant Voss had believed survival could be purchased wholesale, landscaped, and branded. He had not understood that survival is a discipline of subtraction. Less noise, less ego, less appetite, less waste, fewer promises, smaller footprint, harder choices earlier. The road south was rough but passable for the first miles. The desert was cold in that hour before sunrise, with that strange clean stillness Arizona gets when even disaster seems to pause and listen. Then the light came up and showed us what the wider world looked like now. Burned-out vehicles near a county turnoff. A horse loose by a wire fence with no rider in sight. A gas station far off the highway with its canopy lights still on and nobody moving under them. A cluster of figures near a drainage cut that none of us wanted to study too closely. Halfway to the service complex we passed Kenny. He was walking north. No weapon, no hat, dust up to his shins. He saw the convoy and lifted one hand as if trying to flag a friend. Nobody stopped. I do not know whether he was alive at sunset that day. I have guesses, not answers. We reached the secondary site by mid-morning. Naveen had been right. It was ugly, but usable. Partly buried utility sheds, concrete vault access, shade structures with rusted frames, room to conceal vehicles from casual distant view, fewer approach lines, better thermal discipline, and water control equipment that with work might give us something like stable function. It smelled like hot dust, old metal, and stale insulation. To me, it smelled better than the compound ever had, because it smelled honest. That is not the end of the story, obviously. The outbreak did not stop because we moved. People did not become easier because we changed locations. We lost some later. We found others. We built a watch rotation that worked. We learned what to do with silence and what sounds mattered at night. We learned that generosity must be measured or it becomes self-destruction, and that cruelty masquerades as efficiency more often than decent people like to admit. We learned the infected were dangerous, but organized desperation was sometimes worse. But when people ask me where the world ended for me, I do not say the first time I saw the dead move. I do not say the first gunfight at the service gate. I do not say the morning we drove away from the compound. I say it ended in the hallway outside Grant Voss's private suite, when a rich man with a satellite phone and a half-finished fortress still believed survival meant selecting who counted. That was the day I understood exactly what I was guarding. Not a compound, not supplies, not walls, a line between order and fear, between discipline and appetite, between a group that might endure and a crowd that would eat itself alive before the infected ever got through the gate. 10 days before the outbreak, I took a job guarding a survival compound in the Arizona desert because the money was good and the work sounded simple. By day 10, I was deciding who came in, who stayed out, who got a rifle, who got water, who got told no, and whether the whole place was worth defending at all. If you have never stood at a locked gate while people on both sides believe you owe them salvation, you probably still think survival is about strength. It isn't. It is about judgment when every option feels wrong. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.